June 1944, Operation Overlord was a spectacular success, and the Normandy landings opened the door for the Allies to push into Western Europe. After bloody battles at Caen and Saint-Lô and fierce fighting in the Normandy bocage, German forces were finally driven out of their strong defensive lines, creating a strategic gap for American, British, and Canadian forces to advance eastward. Yet while the initial jubilation of victory spread, a new worry confronted Allied high command: how to sustain the momentum of the advance when the logistics system was not yet ready for a continent-scale campaign. The Allies at that moment resembled a sprinter running at breakneck speed whose lungs and heart had not yet caught up. The risk of stalling halfway was very real. In modern warfare, especially mechanized warfare, the supply distance is decisive. A U.S. armored division with hundreds of Sherman tanks, thousands of trucks and armored vehicles, towed artillery, requires an enormous daily supply of fuel. It's estimated that a single armored division consumed an average of 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day, not to mention lubricants, artillery, and machine gun ammunition, food for tens of thousands of troops, and spare parts for thousands of vehicles. When mechanized formations pushed too fast and too far, from the Normandy beaches and where the Mulberry temporary harbors and main supply depots were located, the problem stops being manpower or weapons and becomes whether fuel and ammunition can keep up. France's terrain made the problem worse. Roads were shattered by bombs, bridges were demolished by retreating Germans, and railways could not be relied on because many lines remained in contested areas or were heavily damaged. Trucks became the principal means of transport. But even the United States, the world's most powerful industrial nation, could not instantly mobilize tens of thousands of vehicles solely to serve supply lines stretching hundreds of miles. Fuel stocks staged in Britain before D-Day had been shipped to France and fed by the Pluto pipeline under the ocean system laid beneath the English Channel, but its capacity met only a fraction of the huge needs of the accelerating mechanized armies. German commanders, familiar with Wehrmacht supply difficulties during the invasion of the Soviet Union, clearly understood that every mile of American advance depended on tanker convoys. In reports sent to Berlin, many German officers assessed that the Americans could not sustain their blistering pace for more than a few weeks, because the distance from the beaches to the front was lengthening while Allied rear areas had not yet secured major ports like Antwerp or Le Havre. Some German officers even mocked the Coca-Cola consuming American soldiers, saying they would soon be stopped not by Wehrmacht fire but by empty fuel drums. At Schaff. However, Eisenhower and his staff had seen this danger coming. Eisenhower understood that the initial victory in Normandy would be meaningless if the Allies could not exploit the opportunity and press toward Germany's border while the Wehrmacht was reeling after the Falaise pocket. To do that, he needed an urgent logistical solution. The U.S. forces were particularly hard hit because the mobile warfare doctrine pursued by General George S. Patton demanded a supply system running at full tilt, continually feeding fuel and ammunition so armored divisions could maintain their rate of advance. A telling example came in early August 1944, when Patton's Third Army raced toward Paris. In just a few days, his spearheads covered more than 100 kilometers. But in the midst of that blazing advance, many units were forced to halt in open fields because they ran out of gas. Sherman tanks sat idle, self-propelled guns could not move, and soldiers had to wait for convoys to crawl up from Normandy, journeys that took hours or even days. For Patton, it was a nightmare. As he famously said, "Speed is the essence of mechanized warfare. When we stop, we become a target." Logistical strain was so severe that several American generals proposed slowing the advance to consolidate supply lines. Montgomery, commander of the British forces, argued for concentrating resources on a single breakthrough rather than stretching them across many axes, because the current supply system could not sustain multiple simultaneous thrusts. Eisenhower, while favoring a balanced approach, had to admit that without a creative solution, the entire campaign risked bogging down. Battlefield realities underlined the urgency of logistics. In many units, American soldiers scavenged fuel from other trucks or drained fuel from disabled vehicles to keep the remaining vehicles running. Some artillery units were forced to limit their rounds not for lack of guns or targets, but simply because ammunition stocks could not be delivered in time. Many reports to command bluntly stated, "We do not lack guns or men. We lack the wheels to bring the petrol." The situation became so critical that retreating German generals began to hope logistic strain would save the Wehrmacht. They believed the Americans would have to pause for weeks, giving Germany time to fortify along the Seine and the western German border. Some German intelligence officers even reported that the Americans are turning their victory into defeat by moving faster than their stomachs and fuel tanks can support, but those assessments underestimated the U.S. Army's ability to adapt. The Pentagon and Theater Command did not sit idle. They realized that if the advance stalled, the war could be prolonged by months or even a year, casualties would rise, and American public support might waver. Thus, an unprecedented logistical plan in modern military history was urgently devised. That solution would transform ordinary supply convoys into the backbone of the entire campaign and turn the German ridicule into a deadly miscalculation. That solution was called the Red Ball Express. When the Allies faced a severe logistical crisis after breaking out of Normandy, U.S. command was forced to find a creative solution to maintain the momentum of the advance. Railways could not be relied upon, as most of the system had been sabotaged by the retreating Germans. Major ports such as Antwerp, Le Havre, and Cherbourg were either unusable or not yet under Allied control. The undersea Pluto pipeline across the English Channel, while an engineering marvel, could supply only a fraction of the vast fuel demands of the mechanized armies. In this desperate situation, American planners decided to establish a dedicated transport route, operating continuously and solely for carrying supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines without interruption. From this idea, the Red Ball Express was born. The name Red Ball came from the American railroads of the early 20th century. In the freight system, trains carrying priority cargo were marked with a red circle symbol, the red ball, which meant they had the right of way and could not be delayed. The U.S. Army adopted this concept for its new supply route. Any truck of the Red Ball Express had absolute priority on the road, was not to be stopped or inspected, and had only one mission: deliver supplies to the front as fast as possible. To ensure this, special one-way routes were established. One road outbound to the front, another inbound to the beaches, avoiding the congestion and chaos common in military transport. The Red Ball Express officially began operations on August 25, 1944, just days after Paris was liberated. Thousands of GMC CCKW 212-ton trucks, nicknamed Jimmies, were mobilized. This standard U.S. Army truck could carry nearly 3 tons of cargo, was rugged, easy to repair, and mass-produced in huge numbers. But demand far exceeded initial expectations. To sustain the rapidly advancing armies, tens of thousands of trips per day were required. Within weeks, more than 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers had been assembled, forming a mechanized transport force unprecedented in the history of war. A crucial detail of the Red Ball Express was its drivers. About 75% of them were African American soldiers. In a segregated U.S. military, black troops were often relegated to logistics rather than combat, yet here they became the backbone of the supply lifeline. Thousands of young men, many barely in their 20s, drove day and night over cratered roads, through mines and the threat of German ambushes. They drove at breakneck speed, ignoring safety under orders. Go as fast as possible. If the truck breaks down, abandon it. If blocked, go around. If parts are missing, strip another truck. During those months, the Red Ball Express was both a symbol of American industrial power and a testament to the immense, often overlooked contributions of black soldiers in World War II. Strict rules governed the system. Red Ball convoys ran 24/7, in columns stretching miles, trucks spaced only a few dozen meters apart to prevent bottlenecks. At night, they drove with headlights blazing, against normal military practice, because speed mattered more than concealment. Makeshift refueling stations dotted the route, minimizing delays. Forward depots were set up where trucks unloaded and immediately turned back, wasting no time. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate quick K rations, and kept moving almost nonstop. Improvisation was constant. A broken truck on the roadside was stripped for parts and left behind, creating temporary graveyards of abandoned vehicles along the Red Ball route. But that was acceptable. The priority was keeping as many trucks moving as possible. The results were staggering. On average, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies per day, an enormous feat considering the bombed-out roads and distances of hundreds of kilometers. Everything the armies needed, fuel, ammunition, rations, medicine, spare parts, even clothing and mail, rolled forward on red ball trucks. No other supply line in history had ever moved such a volume so quickly under such conditions. The cost was high. Drivers faced constant risk from exhaustion and accidents. Narrow, broken roads caused frequent crashes and rollovers. Every day brought casualties, yet the flow of trucks never stopped. Many veterans later recalled driving in a near dreamlike state, eyes burning, hands trembling from fatigue, but clinging to the wheel because they knew Patton's armored divisions at the front were waiting for every gallon of fuel, every box of ammunition. The Red Ball Express was not just a logistical innovation. It was a symbol of wartime adaptability. It embodied the American approach to war. With vast industrial resources, the challenge was how to deliver them to the battlefield as quickly as possible, even if it meant breaking every conventional rule. If the Germans believed logistics would halt the Allies, the Red Ball Express was the answer. Not only did the Americans refuse to stop, they accelerated, plunging deeper into France and driving the Wehrmacht to the edge of collapse. The creation of the Red Ball Express stands as a prime example of the U.S. Army's immense organizational and logistical capacity in World War II. While many nations struggled to secure single shipments of fuel or munitions, America built an entire emergency highway system, sustaining it for months, mobilizing tens of thousands of men and machines. It reflected not only American industrial might, but also ingenuity, coordination, and the courage of ordinary soldiers, men gripping steering wheels, rolling through dust, mud, and danger to keep the wheels of war turning. If modern warfare is the fusion of firepower, speed, and mobility, then the Red Ball Express was the most vivid proof of the U.S. Army's immense logistical strength. From the moment it was created, this special supply line was designed on an unprecedented scale, dwarfing any logistics system the world had seen before. Within weeks of the liberation of Paris, the Red Ball Express had mobilized over 6,000 GMC CCKW-212 ton trucks, the workhorse of the U.S. Army in World War II. This vehicle had already been mass-produced in enormous numbers since 1941, with American factories turning out up to 15,000 per month at peak production. As a result, when the urgent need arose in Western Europe, the U.S. could immediately allocate thousands of trucks to the Red Ball without disrupting other missions. But the trucks were only half the story. More critical were the drivers. Over 23,000 soldiers were mobilized to take the wheel, of whom roughly 17,000 were African American. In a racially segregated America, this was a bitter irony, but also a historic fact. Black soldiers, denied many combat opportunities, became the backbone that kept the Allied advance moving. They drove relentlessly, averaging 16-20 hours per day, across rough, dusty, or rain-soaked muddy roads under constant danger. They carried no rifles in the assault, but every truckload of gasoline and ammunition meant that hundreds of artillery pieces could keep firing, dozens of Shermans could keep moving, and thousands of infantrymen could keep fighting and surviving. To operate such a vast system, the U.S. Army built a sophisticated organizational network. 2 dedicated one-way routes were assigned, one outbound from Normandy to the front, and one for the return, preventing congestion. Along the roads, makeshift fueling stations allowed trucks to refuel within minutes before pressing on. Relay depots were established where trucks unloaded quickly and turned back immediately. A typical round trip took about 54 hours, most of it spent driving, with only snatches of rest. The volume of cargo carried was staggering. On average, 2,500 tons per day were delivered to the front. To put this into perspective, that equaled about 625 train loads, or more than 2,000 rail cars packed to capacity. Over 82 days of continuous operation, the Red Ball Express moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies. Thanks to this, Patton's Third Army and many other Allied formations maintained their blistering pace. Without Red Ball, Shermans would have stalled in French fields, artillery would have fallen silent, infantry would have gone hungry, and the offensive would have ground to a halt, giving the Germans precious time to regroup. To reach the 2,500-ton target, Red Ball often defied normal logistical rules. Trucks routinely carried loads well above their 212-ton rating, sometimes hauling 4 tons. Speed was pushed to the limit, regardless of accident risk. At night, instead of blacking out headlights for concealment, convoys blazed their beams, turning the routes into rivers of light stretching for miles, a sight both spectacular and hazardous, but symbolic of the belief that speed outweighed secrecy. Maintenance followed an industrial warfare model. A broken truck was not hauled to workshops. It was stripped for parts or abandoned. This practice created roadside truck cemeteries, but ensured maximum numbers kept rolling. Wasteful as it seemed, it was logical. The value of one truck was nothing compared to the strategic value of keeping an entire campaign moving. Managing 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers demanded iron discipline. Convoys usually moved in groups of 50-60 vehicles under an officer's command. Drivers had to maintain strict spacing and minimum speeds to avoid jams. They were drilled to react instantly to emergencies. If ambushed or blocked, trucks were not to stop but to drive around or push through at all costs. Veterans later recalled the experience felt more like a deadly race than a supply duty. Continuity was another hallmark. Red Ball trucks ran 24 hours a day with no scheduled breaks. Drivers rotated behind the wheel or snatched minutes of sleep slumped over steering wheels before jolting awake to keep driving. In memoirs, some veterans wrote that they lost all sense of day or night, trapped in an endless loop: load, drive, unload, return, repeat. They called it the sleepless whirlpool of the Red Ball. On such a scale, the Red Ball Express quickly became legendary even during the war. The American press hailed it as the steel lifeline of the advance, while frontline troops saw its drivers as unsung heroes. Infantrymen remembered cheering when the rumble of trucks grew near, because it meant fresh shells, food, medicine, and most of all, the gasoline to keep Shermans and half-tracks rolling. The cost, however, was steep. Accidents were common. Many drivers died not from German fire, but from crashes, rollovers, or sheer exhaustion. Hundreds of trucks were wrecked or heavily damaged. Hundreds of soldiers became casualties. Yet with 23,000 men involved, such losses were accepted as part of the mission. For them, keeping the supply line alive outweighed personal safety. Ironically, the Red Ball Express was only ever intended as a temporary fix. It was designed to last a few months until major French ports reopened and railways were repaired. Yet in its short lifespan, its scale and effectiveness reshaped the course of the campaign. It proved that logistics could be solved not only by long-term planning, but also by creativity, rapid organization, and the ability to unleash massive industrial resources at short notice. Compared with the Wehrmacht, the contrast was striking. In 1941, Germany had faced its own logistics nightmare in the Soviet Union, unable to supply hundreds of thousands of troops deep in the vast interior. Starved of fuel and ammunition, they stalled before Moscow. The Americans, confronted with the same challenge in France in 1944, built a mechanized highway system on a scale never before imagined, solving the problem through industrial and organizational might. This difference led German commanders after the war to admit that they were defeated not only by U.S. tanks and planes, but also by U.S. trucks, ordinary GMCs, but ones harnessed within a colossal, relentless system called the Red Ball Express. If one wishes to truly grasp the strategic value of the Red Ball Express, it is impossible to ignore its direct connection to the lightning advances of the U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton. In the history of modern warfare, few commanders have ever demanded such relentless supply. Patton embodied speed. He believed victory did not come from wearing down the enemy in static battles, but from maintaining an unbroken offensive, forcing the enemy into constant retreat and collapsing their entire strategic system. But that philosophy could only be sustained if the Shermans kept moving, the artillery never lacked shells, and the infantry never went hungry. In other words, Patton's fire of advance could only burn thanks to the lifeblood flowing ceaselessly from the Red Ball Express. From the very landings in Normandy, Patton grew impatient with the slow pace of operations. Stalled at first in the bocage hedgerows, once unleashed after Operation Cobra, he instantly demonstrated the power of the maneuver doctrine he had cultivated for years. Within weeks, his Third Army drove over 600 kilometers, liberating swaths of France and sweeping German forces from the west. The advance was so swift it startled even Allied commanders. Yet Patton's greatest threat was not German resistance, but empty fuel tanks. A Sherman tank consumed roughly 2 liters of fuel per kilometer. With thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks under his command, daily fuel demand reached hundreds of thousands of liters. Without the Red Ball Express, his army would have been a starving giant, stranded in the fields of France. In fact, on multiple occasions, Patton's units ground to a halt not because of German fire, but because his tanks simply ran dry. Crews forced to wait until the next convoy arrived. That total dependence proved that logistics was not merely a support, but the essential precondition of Patton's advance. The Red Ball Express thus became Patton's mobile rear. Thousands of trucks each day departed Normandy's ports, loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations, driving non-stop over 500 kilometers into territory that had been under German control just a week earlier. Patton liked to tell his subordinates, "We will advance as far as possible, as fast as possible, and never stop for lack of will." But he also knew sheer will could not replace gasoline. That is why he regarded the Red Ball drivers as silent warriors, unarmored, unarmed, yet carrying the very lifeblood of an entire army. In the memoirs of many Third Army veterans, the most familiar image was not of battle, but of endless convoys stretching into the night, headlights blazing, and by dawn crates of shells, cans of gasoline, and tins of meat arriving like clockwork. These moments convinced the troops they could go anywhere, because behind them flowed a river of steel sustaining their strength. Some compared the Red Ball to a guardian spirit. Whenever it seemed the advance must stop, the convoys arrived, on time, at the right place, bringing life. Patton himself deeply understood and valued logistics. He often reminded his staff that victory was measured not only in divisions or tanks, but also in gallons of fuel, tons of ammunition, and the number of truck wheels turning on the road. He relentlessly pressured superiors for supply priority, clashing with Eisenhower and Montgomery over scarce resources. In the autumn of 1944, with limited fuel entering Western Europe, dividing it between Patton's southern thrust and Montgomery's northern drive became a heated political and military issue. Patton demanded more and faster, convinced that every day lost gave Germany time to regroup. The Red Ball Express strengthened his case. With sufficient trucks and fuel, his army consistently advanced farther than anyone else. Every 100 kilometers gained was proof that investment in mobile logistics was the right choice. Eisenhower himself later admitted that without Red Ball, Patton's advance would have been cut by half, prolonging the campaign in France by months. Yet the very dependence on Red Ball also brought Patton to moments of despair. At times, the convoys were stretched to their limit, trucks wore out, fuel was diverted, and Patton's army was forced to halt on the Moselle River. He was so enraged that he wrote in his diary, "Nothing is more shameful than to halt a victorious army for lack of fuel." That was the harsh reality of war. Even the vast Red Ball system could not indefinitely sustain Patton's breakneck pace. These enforced pauses set the stage for later fierce battles, including the Ardennes. Looking back, however, no one can deny that in the summer and fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express was the keeper of Patton's flame. Without it, the U.S. Army's mad speed demon would have remained just an ambitious general. With it, he became the terror of the Wehrmacht, appearing unexpectedly where least expected, with tanks and artillery that never ran dry. That combination, the iron will of Patton and the mobile rear of Red Ball, created a steel storm that swept the Germans from France. Remarkably, though the Red Ball Express was driven largely by ordinary soldiers, many of them African American, men denied full recognition in their own country, yet they were indispensable to the glory of one of the most famous generals of World War II. This irony of history was profound. Those marginalized at home ensured Patton's triumph abroad. After the war, many Red Ball veterans recalled with pride that without them, Patton's victories might never have happened. When Patton finally entered Germany, many of these drivers saw firsthand the fruits of their grueling convoys, liberated villages, columns of surrendering German prisoners, and crowds of civilians cheering the American advance. They had never fired a shot, yet they knew they had helped make history. That is why keeping Patton's fire burning was not merely a metaphor, it was a reality, fed by every can of fuel, every crate of shells, every truck that rolled through the night. When the Red Ball Express ceased operations in November 1944, after nearly 3 months of non-stop activity, many of the soldiers who took part breathed a sigh of relief. They had lived through sleepless days and nights, driven themselves to exhaustion, abandoned thousands of broken-down vehicles along the roads, and lost friends to accidents or ambushes. Yet at the same time, they knew they had been part of one of the greatest logistical feats in the history of warfare. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to sustain an enormous mechanized army. accelerate the Allied advance, and shorten the war in Europe by at least 6 months. These were not just numbers, but living proof of the power of mobile logistics, a legacy that far outlasted World War II. The first lesson is that the Red Ball Express demonstrated logistics was not a mere supporting task, but a strategic factor that determined the tempo and outcome of an entire war. Before World War II, many military doctrines emphasized tactics, weapons technology, or manpower. But the Red Ball Express showed that even mighty armies with state-of-the-art tanks and artillery were helpless without fuel, ammunition, and food. Hitler's Wehrmacht was the prime example. Lacking oil resources, dependent on synthetic fuel and Romanian fields, once its supply lines were cut, Germany's war machine ground to a halt, despite elite divisions and brilliant commanders. By contrast, America's vast industrial capacity, harnessed through the Red Ball Express, was transformed into immediate battlefield strength. Converting economic superiority into concrete military power, another legacy, profoundly human in nature, was the role of African American soldiers. In a society still steeped in segregation, their assignment as the backbone of the Red Ball Express was not just necessity, but an unintended opportunity to prove their worth. Over 75% of the drivers were black soldiers, often excluded from frontline combat roles. Yet through courage and dedication, they directly contributed to victory in Western Europe. Many veterans later recalled the Red Ball Express as a quiet revolution, where black soldiers showed they could shoulder responsibility equal to anyone. Historians argue this experience planted the seeds of the Civil Rights Movement, creating a collective memory that tens of thousands of African Americans had helped liberate Europe, and that their nation could not deny their contribution forever. From a military technical perspective, the Red Ball Express became a classic case study in modern logistics. Never before had a separate road network been established, running 24/7, with absolute priority given to a massive convoy system. Rules such as one-way traffic, makeshift refueling stations, and the motto, "Abandon broken trucks, keep the convoy moving," defied traditional supply thinking, yet proved highly effective in the era of fast mechanized warfare. After the war, U.S. and NATO military academies taught the Red Ball Express as a model of flexible adaptation under emergency conditions. Later American operations, from Korea to the Gulf War to Iraq, bore traces of the same Red Ball mindset. Prioritize speed, ensure continuous flow, and treat logistics as a strategic weapon. The Red Ball Express also reshaped views on defense industry. Without mass production of GMC CCKW trucks, abundant spare parts, and tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline shipped across the Atlantic daily, the Express could never have functioned. This reminded leaders that in modern war, industrial power and logistics are inseparable. An army's strength is not just its tanks, but its ability to fuel, repair, and supply them. From this lesson, post-war America further developed its defense industrial base, interstate highway system, and global logistics network, foundations of its military superpower status in the second half of the 20th century. A less discussed but vital aspect was morale. The Red Ball Express gave frontline soldiers confidence they would never be abandoned. In every campaign, troop morale depended on certainty of resupply. When they saw endless convoys racing through the night with headlights blazing, they knew a vast machine stood behind them. That faith boosted morale, making them fight more confidently and advance without fear of being stranded without ammo or food. Of course, the Red Ball Express also carried warnings. Patton and the Allies' total reliance on it exposed a critical vulnerability. If severed by major counterattacks or sabotage, the entire offensive could stall. In fact, the Wehrmacht recognized this, but lacked the strength for large-scale disruption. Had they been able to strike effectively, the Allied advance might have slowed dramatically. This underscored that logistics is both strength and Achilles' heel, demanding as much protection as any battlefield front. When the war ended, many Red Ball veterans returned home and faded into obscurity. They received no great medals, no newspaper glory, just truck drivers. Yet history has since acknowledged that those truck drivers helped reshape the fate of a continent. Documentaries, veteran reunions, and logistics studies affirm the Red Ball Express as one of the U.S. Army's most vital yet unsung achievements. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy is its reminder that wartime glory is not reserved for those carrying rifles. The Red Ball Express proved victory was built on sweat, patience, and the courage of ordinary men. They did not storm trenches, but faced death on endless roads where a crash or a mine could kill. They were not hailed as battlefield heroes, yet they kept the offensive alive. To remember World War II properly is not only to recall Normandy, Stalingrad, or Berlin, but also the ceaseless rolling wheels of the Red Ball Express. Today, in historical memory and military study, the Red Ball Express remains proof that sometimes the decisive factor in war is not the most advanced weapon, but the ability to deliver a can of fuel, a box of bullets, or a hot meal at the right place and time. That simple, eternal truth of modern warfare is the enduring legacy the Red Ball Express left to humanity.